Again, if you have a New Testament handy, turn with me to Mark chapter 5. We looked at the beginning of the chapter this morning. We'll look at the end of the chapter this evening. One of the reasons I'm doing this is I'm teaching the teens the Gospel of Mark upstairs, and we get into these discussions and play a few games and talk the text, and I just don't get enough done. So I have to preach some sermons to cover what I don't cover in class. So it's a default in me, I suppose. But I do like to zero in on some things when we might have a little more time to really dive in and look at something. When trying to cover maybe a chapter and a half a week, you feel like you're just zooming one paragraph after the next, and this gives us a chance to kind of take a little bit of a closer look. It's been a good day. Andrea and I went out with Han and Jan for lunch, and Jan is one of these three girls that are in this Bible study on Monday night. She might even be tuning in tonight. I don't know. They were talking about maybe driving down to Monterey and seeing Talon because he was in part of that Bible class. But she was asking, she's down in UC Riverside, about to move to Irvine, close to Tustin, where I preached for 16 years, put her in contact with folks there already. But she said, when I get ready to be baptized, can I do it here? And so, absolutely. And so even when we do these distance learning studies, some good things happen. And a lot of good things are happening right now. And we have so much to be thankful for. And I'm just grateful to God. So we looked at the first half of Mark 5 this morning. I have to tell you that we do screening for these interns before they come here. I had to check Reagan out. I don't know about this guy. Can you imagine the elders sitting at the bottom of that hill, looking at a man that's kind of naked and wounded, with self-inflicted stone cuts, with shackles broken from his limbs, crying out night and day in the tombs? You know, I think that guy would be a good evangelist. Let's hire him. And yet Jesus sees possibilities where we don't. And he is the one that proclaims in all of Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him. And on the heels of that, Jesus and his disciples who've come in a boat to land right where this man runs into Jesus, they get right back into the boat. That's all they do. Is Jesus cast out the legion and 2,000 pigs go down into the water, and the apostles' minds are on overload trying to process all of this that they've just witnessed. And then they get back in the boat. Okay, it's time to leave. And then two other major events happen. And so let's begin reading verses 21 through 24 of Mark 5. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. So they are in the region of the Decapolis, somewhere on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. They get back into the boat, southeastern side, go to the northwestern side, back to Capernaum, back to where Peter, Andrew, probably James and John, certainly Levi, Matthew were living, and Jesus used as his base of operations for this evangelistic effort in Galilee. And they cross the boat to the other side, and a large crowd gathers about him. And there's an aerial view of Capernaum. You see right in the middle of the picture, there's the ruins of a 4th century synagogue that sits on top of a 1st century synagogue. And right below it is an enclosure that sits over the house, the ruins of the house that archaeologists think was Peter's house. And that's how close Peter's house is to the synagogue, just a stone's throw away, a couple of minute walk. And then you have the coast, where Peter, Andrew, James, and John had a fishing business at one point. And there's the 4th century ruins of the synagogue. And in light of what we've just read, you have one of the rulers of the synagogue comes to Jesus. There's this great crowd. And in fact, the greatness of the crowd is emphasized again and again. Verses 21 and 24, you have a great crowd gathered about him. Verse 24, a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And that's a repeated refrain. And Jairus is one of the rulers of the synagogue. An otherwise respectable man is desperate. He's got this little girl, 12 years old, and all the other options are exhausted, and his only chance to save her life is Jesus. And so he throws respectability out the window, and he falls down at his feet and he begs on behalf of his daughter. The rulers of the synagogue were essentially presidents or heads of the local Jewish worshiping community. Synagogue leaders were not a professional class. They were not paid per se. A ruler of the synagogue was not necessarily professionally trained as a rabbi or a scribe, but was a lay member of the community entrusted by the elders of the community with general oversight of the community's affairs. Sometimes there were more than one, rulers, plural, of the synagogue, and this man was one of those. He fell at Jesus' feet, and implored him earnestly. So here a respected member of the community is at the point of desperation. And he says, my little daughter is at the point of death. She's at death's door and sinking fast. And he begs Jesus to come. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. And the text says that he went with him. So they're on the way from when Jesus gets out of the boat and is thronged by these crowds to Jairus' house. And Jesus is interrupted on the way. This is an emergency situation, and he's interrupted. And so verse 25, and there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. Incidentally, that last part of verse 26 is not mentioned in Luke's account. I'll just say that. Luke doesn't mention any of that about doctors not being able to help the woman. He doesn't cover that part. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone forth from him, immediately turned about in the crowd, and he said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So you have here this interruption, and with not a moment to spare, this interruption occurs, and a woman with a menstrual hemorrhage, evidently, whose desperation is quieter but scarcely less urgent, moves toward Jesus in the jostling crowd. The text says in verses 27 and 28, she heard, she came, she touched. She touched Jesus. It's a good recipe for discipleship. You hear, you come, you touch. Come to Jesus. No one comes to Jesus without first hearing about him. Faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the message of Christ. Romans 10:17. But we must act on what we hear. And she does. 12 years is how long she's been in this condition. I can't even begin to imagine that kind of a health situation. 12 years of bleeding and no doctor able to help her. Frustration, shame, having to deal with all of that, weakness, perhaps. And it comes to a stop, just like that. She hears about Jesus, she touches the fringe of his garment, and she is completely healed. 12 years comes to an end. And Jesus says, "Who touched you?" And his disciples are saying, "Who touched you? The whole world wants a piece of you. How could you say who touched you? Everybody's after you." Jesus had perceived that power had gone forth from him. Disciples are fixated on the size of the crowd. But he looks around to see who had done it, and this woman fesses up. During his time on earth, Jesus experienced life through the same physical senses that we employ. He feels, he turns, he looks, he asks. And he's not content to dispatch a miracle to someone who remains incognito. He wants to encounter a person, not just dispense supernatural power. I think that's important to understand. Discipleship is not just about cosmic free candy. Discipleship is not just about getting a need met. It's about being in the presence of Jesus and being known by Jesus. Unable to evade Jesus' searching gaze, the woman comes forward and confesses. She came in fear and trembling, according to verse 33, perhaps reflective of many years of social ostracism, shame, pain. She fell down before him. She told him the whole truth. Guilty is charged. I'm the one who did this. It may be that because of what Leviticus 15 says about verse 25 and following, that a woman in bleeding should not go around touching anybody. You could make a case, at least, that what she did was in technical violation of the law of Moses. But Jesus, considering the woman's social stigma, his response is remarkable, and he reassures her. He does not come down hard on her. With tender compassion, he says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." The word for make well or heal can also mean save. Your faith has saved you. Miracles are demonstrations of some aspect of kingdom power, nature of the kingdom. It's not just to heal a woman's blood flow, it's to show us something in a far greater canvas. And just as her faith could save her, our faith can save us too. It's not faith in faith, it's faith in the Lord and his healing power. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. Wonderful little episode. Happens just in passing on the way to Jairus' home. And one conversation bleeds into the next. So verse 35, beginning, says, "While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, 'Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?' But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, 'Do not fear, only believe.' And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, 'Why are you making commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping.' And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, 'Talitha cumi,' which means, 'Little girl, I say to you, arise.' And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. So one conversation bleeds into the next. Devastating news. A dispatch from the house says to Jairus, 'Your daughter is dead,' and adds the words, 'Why trouble the teacher any further?' The drama intensifies, and Jesus overhears this, and he says to the ruler, 'Do not fear, only believe.' Verse 36. This is the relevant challenge to every believer. Do not be afraid, only believe. I do not believe that all of Jesus' miracles were predicated on faith, but sometimes he draws the connection, again, to show on a larger canvas what the kingdom of heaven is all about. That in coming to God to have our greatest need met, we have to believe. And as a preliminary to that, these miracles sometimes underscore that point. That in light of what the Lord can do for you, do you have the requisite faith to truly accept it and to embrace it with everything in you? Because that's what the kingdom is all about. It's the relevant challenge to every believer. Don't be afraid, believe. Do we limit ourselves by what circumstance will allow or put our faith in God who makes all things possible? Is the door closed or is the door still open? It's interesting to me that Peter, James, and John are the ones who are granted access. You notice how many times Peter, James, and John are alone with Jesus? At the Transfiguration, Garden of Gethsemane, here, and even beyond into the book of Acts, you have Peter and John going up to the temple to pray. Acts 3, Peter and John appearing before the Sanhedrin Council. It just flabbergasts me that people are in denial that John is the disciple whom Jesus loved, but some people are. It just makes no sense in light of what the text says over and over again. The cumulative case that can be made even in the Gospel of John. But all that said, Peter, James, and John are often a threesome that accompany Jesus, and they do so here. And so at the house, there is commotion, weeping, and loud wailing. And Jesus says the child is not dead, but sleeping. And verse 40 says they laughed at him. They laughed at Jesus. I have trouble with getting my head around that one. They laughed at Jesus. And they represent people, I suppose, of every age who decide when empirical realities have foreclosed on divine possibilities and they close that door because it just isn't part of their worldview. And so you have a private moment where Peter, James, John, Jairus, his wife, they go into the room where the girl evidently is dead. And taking her by the hand, he says, Talitha Kumi. And you have the original Jewish Aramaic represented here. Aramaic for lamb or youth or little one. Arise. Mark's translation of little girl or little lady. Arise. It's endearing. And the result of it is she gets up immediately and starts walking, just like all 12-year-old girls are meant to do. And everybody witnessing this is overcome with amazement. Peter, who represents this to Mark, I believe, is one of those people. Overcome with amazement. Complete astonishment. And he strictly charged them that no one should know about this. Give her something to eat. Later it will become part of the public record that would be preached throughout the whole world. Talitha Kumi. And the last laugh occurs just a little while later. What do these two episodes have in common? Faith is the victory. What does Mark accomplish by sandwiching the woman's story into the story of Jairus' daughter? The two have a lot of things in common. Both are victims of despondent, desperate circumstances, have no hope apart from Jesus. The little girl is 12 years old. The woman had a discharge for 12 years. The number 12 comes up. Jairus has a name, a position, and some clout in the community. The woman has none of these things. Her name is not given, and she has no position. Her only identification is her shame. She's the no-name woman who comes to Jesus. But it really doesn't matter, because Jesus is not going to play favorites to one or the other. Despite her embarrassing circumstances, she does essentially the same thing Jairus does. Jairus does not hold any advantage with Jesus regarding certain matters. It's the woman who exemplifies faith, and in this respect, their roles are reversed. Jesus urges Jairus not to be afraid, but to have faith. Despite her embarrassing circumstances, she pushes through the crowd to reach Jesus. In spite of her gender, her namelessness, her uncleanness, her shame, none of these things stop her from reaching Jesus and touching Jesus. She's got to get to Jesus. And she does. And her whole life is changed. She didn't say, well, I don't have a chance, and therefore why try? She barged in and got to Jesus. And her whole life was changed. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. And to Jairus, Jesus says, do not be afraid, only believe. It's going to work out. Don't be afraid, believe. What kind of faith should he have in such desperate circumstances? The answer is that he must have the kind of faith that this woman had. That's what kind of faith. The woman exemplifies and defines what kind of faith that Jairus is to have and that we are to have. It means to trust Jesus in spite of everything to the contrary, a faith that knows no limits, not even the limit of raising a dead child. So, you have the role of faith in both episodes. Quite amazing. Jesus can stop a blood flow that no doctor can heal. And Jesus can raise a little girl from the dead, even when others are laughing in scorn. Can he save you from your sins and raise your dead corpse and take you away with him for all eternity and after a while into his heaven? If he can do these things, can he not do that for you? Do not be afraid. Believe. And may your faith reach that moment of surrender where you repent and are baptized into Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of every sin you've ever committed. To be saved. To be saved. Think about that as we stand and sing the song of invitation.